Hi, it's Jerry Roberts back again. It is Wednesday, July 22nd, and welcome to episode 363 of Journal of the Plague Year. Today we have a special guest, particularly for political junkies, a conversation with one of the most influential and consequential political consultants in California and the nation in the last 4 decades. And I am talking about Joe Rodota, also known as Dr. Death in certain quarters. He's a pioneer in creating the discipline of opposition research in campaigns. He's also a Renaissance man. He's a writer, the author of The Watergate, which we'll talk about a little bit, a playwright, and currently host of a new podcast called Oppo File. Joe, thanks so much for joining us. It's great to see you again.
Hey, Jerry, thanks for having me on.
So you grew up in Northern California, Sonoma County, graduated from history in Stanford. Can you give us just a quick recap of your political career and kind of what various positions you've held at various times
Yeah.
for presidents and governors and others?
Yeah, so I graduated from Stanford and went back east almost like within a week and worked in Washington in the 80s. I had a couple jobs in Capitol Hill before being recruited into the Reagan administration. My career has sort of been in government and in politics. Most recently, I've sort of shifted into writing, but I started in opposition research in 1984. I was part of a unit at the Republican National Committee, the opposition research unit. It was like the first time, we'll talk about probably on the show, but first time that computers had been applied to the task of managing content in an opposition research environment. And then from there, I went to the White House and I was Deputy Director of Public Affairs in the second Reagan term and ran what was the equivalent today of rapid response and war room. But in 1980, rapid response is basically putting things in the mail.
So we had the fax machine there too.
We had fax machines, but I didn't use the fax machines that much. I ran the talking point system and the Reagan record system. And I came out to California, did the Bush campaign in 88 out here as a policy director for California. And I had a consulting firm, it's where you and I first met, ran 3 cycles. So it was one of the first small businesses in this niche of opposition research. Back in the day, there were maybe 10 dozen or so small Oppo firms, and that was sort of the early stages of it. And I'm still friends with people from that era, including our mutual friend Ace Smith, who ran a Democratic Oppo firm out of San Francisco, with Rahm Emanuel, who went on to become chief of staff for Obama. One of my clients during that process, one of my clients was Governor Pete Wilson, and that's the campaign where you and I met. Right. And Wilson hit a rough patch in the first year or two of his gubernatorial term, and so he asked me to come inside, and I became cabinet secretary, which is basically the chief operating officer for the state of California. And I worked for him pretty much all the way through his term. And then I spent some time in software. And then beginning about 6 years ago, I started writing under my own byline. So there's a book, I wrote a book, The Watergate, Inside America's Most Infamous Address. Available wherever books are sold. And then just released this week a play based upon something that happened when I was writing that book. I stumbled across, I was doing with the Watergate, I was researching pretty much every resident of the Watergate who had appeared in the news over a 40-year period, including a woman named Rosemary Woods, who was Nixon's confidential secretary, and is quite famous for something called the Rosemary Stretch, which is where she
17-minute gap.
Yeah, well, she tried to explain how it was physically possible for this tiny person to span the length of an office and erase 18 minutes of Nixon's Oval Office tapes. And well, so it turned out, as I was sort of putting the Rose story, she lived in the Watergate. I interviewed people who had been to her parties. She was known for her artichoke and other dips. She was very fun, and it's in the book, but it's possible she got so mad at a Republican senator who lived in the building and betrayed Nixon's trust that she may have keyed his Mercedes-Benz in the Watergate parking lot. It's unclear. There was no cameras, right? But at the time, in the course of that, I learned that Rosemary Woods was consulting a psychic throughout the Watergate, throughout her time in Washington, a woman named Jean Dixon. Mm-hmm. And so I just sort of I just kind of imagine, like, here's the depth of Watergate, and Rosemary Woods, somebody personally very close to President Nixon. She was mistreated by the boys. She was mistreated by Haldeman, mistreated by Ehrlichman. But she was, according to most reports, the fifth Nixon, the fifth member of the family. And she consulted a psychic. And so it was really stuck in my mind. So then when I finished the book, I went back to the archives and started digging around Jean Dixon. And so I just released a play this week on Apple Podcast called The Jean Dixon Effect, which is the life of the celebrity psychic Jean Dixon, told from her perspective of her house, her townhouse in DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. And I won't give any spoilers, but you got Nixon, you got Nancy Reagan, you got J. Edgar Hoover, and you have a psychic cat. So basically, everything you could ever want in American drama is all in one neat little package.
I'd go heavy with a cat on the market show.
Yeah, she had a psychic cat who could give readings, but only through her. Okay. And so I tell the story of Mike the cat, Mike the magic cat. Yeah.
All right. So back to opposition research. So as you say, you were one of the first consultants to really focus on that as a niche. What, people have this impression, guys sneaking around in raincoats and stuff. And what is opposition research? I mean, how do you define it?
So opposition research is the function within a political campaign of gathering public information about your opponent, the person running for office against your client, your candidate, and identifying strengths and weaknesses in that record and constructing the campaign's narrative on how to beat this person. So it's a little bit of sleuthing, a little bit of archival library work, and it's a lot of storytelling and fact-checking. And I had a boss, a brilliant man who I worked for in '84, and he mentored me throughout my entire career as an Oppo researcher. His name was Ken Kachigian, very, very famous. And he said his mantra was, campaigns are won in the library. And that's sort of the opposition research credo, that thoughtful analysis of the opponent is the foundation of your campaign's eventual success. Now, it's a little, and one way, also another way to think about it is Oppo is like bleach, applied appropriately, it's a good disinfectant, and used inappropriately, it could be dangerous to one's health. You don't want to ingest. Don't want to ingest it inappropriately.
But the other piece of it is in a political campaign is most candidates for large offices hire opposition researchers to research themselves to find out what their old vulnerabilities are.
That's we've touched upon it in a couple episodes of Oppo File, and it seems to be it'll be coming up again and again. So Susan Estrich, who's in episode 2, said that early on in the 1988 campaign, she put some very, very smart people on the question of researching Michael Dukakis, the Democratic governor of Massachusetts and the Democratic nominee. And she said, I can prepare for anything, but I can't deal with something I don't know that's coming. Right? So it's in Oppo research, it's called either a vulnerability study or self-research. And it's actually now institutionalized in presidential campaigns. There is a unit now within Oppo dedicated to self-research
Wow.
all the way through the process. And you're looking for, how are you going to defend, what attacks are going to come at your candidate, and how are you going to organize the defense? What are you going to keep in your back pocket for the rebuttal? What are you going to put out, proactively? And because you want to be able to respond quickly to charges, and they can be pretty granular. I was participated in a sort of a Zoom conversation with a couple of researchers from the Democratic primary this year. And they said that they've got incredibly detailed questions about their candidates' records that were almost like down to the the block in the town or something like that. What happened to this building? So it's very, very interesting.
Yeah.
I have had to do them a few times. I never really liked them because it's just it's hard to expose directly to the candidate like what you found, so it's better. I was more comfortable just sort of sharing that with the campaign manager and the press secretary, and just kind of keeping it away from the candidate.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned you and I met in the 90s when you were working for Governor Wilson, Pete Wilson, former Senator Pete Wilson. I think it was 1990.
Yeah.
When he ran against Dianne Feinstein, the mayor of San Francisco, who I thought I knew fairly well. But as I recall, you had 23 legal boxes full of documents that you assembled on her, and I mean, some of it was just amazing stuff, going back to like the Women's Prison Board minutes of 1960 and stuff when she was on there. But I'm curious, you were doing it then, largely in print, trying to find all of these documents and so on. And then obviously we've come into the Google era. Has it changed much or made it easier, harder, or is there just a lot more stuff that's available?
Yeah, so my career as a partisan Oppo researcher is intensely 84 to 94. So it sort of wraps up at the Wilson reelect. And then I return a few years later to help Arnold Schwarzenegger. First with a little bit of, I wouldn't say called vulnerability study, but just helping him map out where he was on different issues. I wrote a book called Arnold A to Z, which is still private, but has been referenced in various places. And I ran something called Schwarzenegger University, which was the nickname for the policy shop. But I came back in 06. And so the difference between 94 and 06 was really quite substantial, and it's gotten more intense ever since then. The raw materials used to be, as you said, mostly libraries, newspaper clippings, newspaper morgues, things like that. And it shifts to the internet quite dramatically, and then takes another shift to social media. So social media is kind of like this whole new area of the online world that opposition researchers currently mine. So, but it doesn't necessarily diminish the value of research into material, trying to locate material that's offline. And one way to think about it is if both sides have a laptop, both sides know what's on the internet. So how do you get an advantage, and how do you get surprise in a political campaign? Well, you have to look for things that might not already be on the internet. Back to Feinstein, that was that's why Susan Yoakum covered the race. Our wonderful friend Susan. Yeah, and I think it might have been this situation where back in the day, librarians kept what were called vertical files on famous citizens. Yeah, I don't think that happens anymore, but in the past, there would be people who would organize newspaper clips and ephemera, like letters and brochures and things, and put them in files alphabetically about your town, or about somebody who lived in your town. And so I went to the San Francisco. I sent a researcher to the San Francisco Public Library, and we retrieved their vertical file on Dianne Feinstein. And in that file were articles that had been misfiled or mislaid by the San Francisco Chronicle. So I had articles from the Chronicle that I got from the San Francisco Public Library that that you and your colleagues didn't know existed because they never made it um, into the Chronicle's morgue file that the reporters would mine, and that was I used that as an example about always keep looking and always expect surprises, and some of the early material on Feinstein turned out to be quite useful.
Yes, and I remember after that campaign, which I think Wilson won by 3.5 or something like that. Bill Carrick, who ran Diane's campaign, told me it was like getting up every morning and having somebody throw marbles in front of you, because it was just day after day after day. There was something. There was a lot on the death penalty at that time. There was stuff about the environment and so on. Now, was there like a book of Dianne Feinstein days, that there was something for each day? Am I recalling that correctly?
So I did a sort of a humorous facts of the day, like a quote of the day or something like that. We just would throw something out mostly internal, but usually they leaked. So I worked for a press secretary named Otto Boss, who was a former journalist. He passed away, sadly, right after Governor Wilson was elected. He was a great guy. He was super competitive. So he would basically plan out what he was going to drop day after day after day, and he was a master at timing, and so we had to supply him constantly. And I remember one night he calls me, and it was like 11:30 at night, and I'm in Sacramento and he's in San Diego. He had arranged for the first drop of the LA Times was always picked up. It hits a certain newsstand or wherever at 10:30 or something like that. And then Otto would have some intern drive it. That intern's probably now CEO of something, but we would have this intern get that paper and drive it to San Diego every night. And so I am in bed trying to get to sleep. The phone rings and it's Otto, and he says, "Did you see the LA Times?" And so he was super competitive, and that was, you're trying to win page 3. So page 3 is sort of that's the A3 is the page where all the most important political fights are being waged, right? That was like the page, and so Otto was pretty good at that. An Oppo researcher, usually it's changed recently. We can talk about that, but in the day, there was a division of labor. The opposition researcher thanks, reads, organizes, finds, tees up. The press secretary maintains the relationships with the press and manages the timing of the earned media campaign. And so you never would have the Oppo researcher just say, "Here's what I found," and put it out there. It always gets filtered. Now that's changed because now you have these entities called Oppo Research, known as Opposition Research Super PACs, and they don't go through campaigns anymore. They just they find something, they just put it out, and they put it out on Twitter and YouTube, and then they move on to the next thing they're going to put out.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's so different. And I will say, my recollections of that campaign, I mean, it was never really personal stuff about Diane, of which there was some. It was really very issues focused. But I'm thinking particularly, you guys put something out about how she had once been for quotas in terms of appointments to boards and commissions and stuff. And she said, "No, I wasn't." But the point was to put the other guy on defense and have them try to explain something that you've come up with.
Right. There was a moment, in the debate where Wilson, who had, late in the campaign had decided to endorse term limits for the state legislature, and Dianne Feinstein opposed that. She opposed term limits, and Otto let obviously, yeah. So Otto Boss let her go out like 2-3 days of saying, I've always been opposed to this and blah, blah. And then he dropped something that I had, which was in her first campaign for supervisor. She said, "I'm for term limits because it's a way to get more women and people of color into office." And And I think that really shocked the Feinstein people because they were like, "What?" Like, and but there was a series of exchanges around savings and loan, which was a big problem at the time. And I may turn to this topic for a future project, but so this was in the sort of your listeners may recall there was a guy named Charles Keating who ran Lincoln Savings and Loan, I think.
Lincoln Savings and
Yeah.
Loan, yeah.
And he famously entraps members of the Senate, mostly Senate members of Congress, to start carrying water for him. And he's, and his savings loan collapses it's in shambles, and the savings loan crisis was really damaging to the economy, and also this guy was very politically active, and so Feinstein was attacking Wilson. I can't recall the details, but it was either a vote or a small contribution. But he's really nowhere. Wilson's, as you know, is a very straight shooter. He would never get into relationships that were troubling, and so she was popping him constantly, and it was in this environment that people were
Cranston,
very upset. Cranston, the other senator, was a member of the Keating Five, and he suffered for that politically. So she's trying to kind of pull Pete Wilson into it, and so, but then I discovered through it's just kind of by chance, because I had to look into another campaign where somebody was a money manager, and so I found Feinstein's husband's SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, disclosures about where he was placing investor money. Now, backing up slightly, 1990 campaign, John Van de Kamp, her Democratic opponent, was attacking her very viciously and personally, and demanding her husband release his client list. And her husband manages money for wealthy people. And he just wasn't going to do it, And so there was all this fixation on, like, where's your client list? Who are your clients? Just this incredible fixation, right? And of course, it's like, he's just not going to do it. So I figured out that you didn't. That's not the conversation you want to have. I found where the money went, and where the money went included savings and loans. And so that was a huge gotcha. And I later learned from somebody in the Feinstein campaign that that Blum, this person would go and say, like, we got this problem here, and they're saying this, and he'd go, oh yeah, I forgot to mention that.
Yeah, a lot of that. I remember that, and the reason I remember it was because of the fax. We used to get these like 40-page faxes from you guys.
From Otto.
Going up with an ad, and here's all of the backup for the ad.
Oh yeah. Well, this is so this is actually something I've been thinking about lately about advertising on Facebook, and how much fretting there has been and outrage over the misinformation in political ads.
Yeah.
And in our day, so every television commercial that I would see it at the front end. It's usually based on my work, or if it was a comparative ad or negative ad, it'd be based on my work. And then I see it at the back end, because I like word for word have to verify every sentence and provide the factual backup for that. And then we do a package. Often it would be reviewed by a lawyer, and then it would go out, to all the stations and all the reporters. And it was just part of saying, like, here, we're standing behind, this is the full, we're giving you one sentence in the ad, but here's the whole article. Here's an arrow to where the sentence is. And so the ads then could survive the fact-checking process by the papers.
That was the campaign in which the truth box was actually invented.
Yeah. In fact, I should probably think about, maybe it's a good thing you mentioned that, because I think that would make an interesting episode about truth boxes, and how did Oppo researchers deal with truth boxes, and what happened to the truth box.
Yeah. Well, it went the way of the truth, I think.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the podcast, Joe, the Oppo File. The first episode really goes back to the history of opposition research, and all the way to the campaign of Andrew Jackson. But the second episode, I just want to talk a little bit about, because it's about the '88 campaign, presidential campaign between George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis, where the Willie Horton ad, famous 4 Willie Horton ads, as you say in the podcast, really come out. What's the significance of that campaign and that particular issue?
So that campaign really stands out in modern history as sort of like an early high point, I would say, or low point, where opposition research is very key in the 1988 campaign. You have George H.W. Bush, pretty much a known quantity, he's vice president for Reagan, and kind of just trying to slot in for the third Reagan term, while also emerging from Reagan's shadow. But Michael Dukakis had emerged from the Democratic primary in a very, very good position. And he was kind of coming across as a guy, a Democrat who knows how to run a state, sort of a forerunner of, the Bill Clinton, new Democrat. Like here's a Democrat who knows how to deliver, keeps taxes low, builds your economy,
Against crime.
Exactly right. So it's sort of he's like the forerunner of Clinton. And I did not appreciate how deeply involved Bill Clinton was in the 88 campaign until I interviewed Susan Estrich. So what happens so here you have, and Dukakis is running well ahead of Bush in the polls. And the Bush campaign realizes that nobody knows anything about Dukakis. He's like this empty vessel, and into which people are just putting their, like, oh, that guy must be great. And so Lee Atwater says to his research director, a guy named Jim Pinkerton, is like, the path to victory is through opposition research. And and he gives Jim, he said, I don't need a book. I'm going to give you a 3x5 card. And you just put whatever you put on that card about Dukakis is where we're going to run this campaign on, and you can use both sides of the card. And so Pinkerton famously picks out 7 things and writes 7 statements on the front and back of the card. And one of those is that to take on Dukakis over a prison furlough program, under which state prisoners could leave prison on a Friday and come back on a Monday or Sunday night, maybe. And it was a design. It was like a tool. Actually, it was used. It was pretty common at the time. I'd be curious. I think it might be just not exist at all now. But at the time, a majority, somewhere between 30 and all states and the federal government had some sort of program like this. With the case of one prisoner in particular, a guy named William Horton, it goes horribly wrong. And he does not return from his 10th furlough. He goes to Louisiana. He ends up in Maryland a year later, and he commits a really horrendous crime. And then is sent to jail and is jailed in Maryland. And the judge in Maryland said, "You're going to serve your time here because I'm not sending you back to Massachusetts so you can get another vacation." And so the town where Horton's original crimes were committed in Massachusetts, is outraged that this guy got out. And so it's just this grassroots newspaper-led sort of revolt against the policy, and Dukakis handled it very poorly. He vetoed a bill to change the rules, the law. There was an attempt that the Democratic legislature, they wanted a problem to go away. And they could see this, they could see this building and hurting them, and the governor was just not moving. But they wanted to amend it so that if you were a lifer and you were not eligible for parole, you would not get your weekend furlough. So somebody serving life without parole doesn't get a weekend off because there's no incentive to have that person go back, right? And Dukakis had vetoed that. So this becomes a big part of the campaign, and it's sort of the lingering. We may look at that campaign in other ways because I'm interested in, the Oppo researchers and how they looked at flag burning and the death penalty, whatever. But the really, the big story of that campaign is William Horton. He is known at the time as Willie Horton. I was a little surprised when I was working on this that he said that my name's never been Willie. He goes by William, so I refer to him as William. it explodes, right? So it's a devastating impact on the Dukakis campaign. And in the next episode, which we're releasing shortly, we look back at that campaign, what happens next, what happens after the campaign is won, how do Republicans look back at that moment, how do Democrats, and then in this current moment, how does everybody look back at race and policing?
Right. Yeah. I'm really looking forward to that, to hearing your podcast on that, because in the our sort of reckoning over a race and so on, the Willie Horton thing plays such a huge part in the narrative of our politics. Let me. We just got a couple minutes left, and I do want to get your. So you mentioned that you had that period as a partisan, as a Republican researcher. Where are you now? Are you a Trumper, a never Trumper, a never Trumper?
I'm past the point where people care where I am. I am. I think you could safely say, like many of my colleagues who have worked in the White House, that there is deep concern over how that institution has fared under the incumbent. So I have listeners who are Trumpers. I have listeners who are never Trumpers. So, and I don't want, at the end of the process, I don't want people to look for a political bias that isn't there. But it's a lack of, well, if you worked for Reagan, and as I did, and saw that day to day, most of what you see daily coming out of the White House and the Rose Garden is appalling. I would like to sort of clarify, or give you the elevator pitch for your listeners, what Oppo File is about. So it is about the history of opposition research, so campaigns in which research played a role in the outcome, for good or like bad research blowing up a campaign, good research helping somebody to victory. It's also it will explain the practice of Oppo research. So in this in one episode, for example, we talk about how one gets in goes on the road and goes into enemy territory to get documents. We're going to return to that over time. We're going to also look at vulnerability studies, tracking, fact checking, vetting donors for toxicity, before you cash the check, that sort of thing. And then also trying to give voice to these Oppo researchers from both parties, hear their war stories and how they go about their work. These Oppo researchers in the world of politics are usually good storytellers. They're interesting. They're usually very smart, but they're also introverted. And these are the people who are comfortable just thinking and reading and writing and sending the email. They're not as comfortable, talking to the press and being out there. But so I want to bring some of these personalities forward, because there's some really wonderful, interesting people, and they do a very interesting, high pressure job. So that's what the show's about.
No, it's fascinating stuff. I mean, I'm a lot of political podcasts I listen to, I kind of, I know that, but it's really all new stuff to me, who's, spent only, 50 years following this stuff. So congratulations on that. Now I have to ask you the last question. Tell us how you earned the nickname Dr. Death, and what's that?
So we will explore this in a future. I will disclose more of this in a future episode. But I made a presentation to the senior campaign leadership on John Van de Kamp, who everyone assumed would be the Democratic nominee. He was the Attorney General, and Dianne Feinstein seemed to be not mounting a vigorous campaign. And so I was hired to research John Van de Kamp. And so I made my first presentation, and Otto Boss, we keep mentioning Otto, he presentation went very well. I was the first Oppo researcher, professional Oppo researcher that anybody really encountered in the room. And Otto said, we need to, you're part of the family now, I need to give you a nickname. And he said there was a guy, it was a pollster named Dick Dresner, whose nickname was Dr. Doom, because all the polls were bad. Like every poll was, it's just things were going to be terrible. So we're turning now to Dr. Doom. And so Otto says, I think we'll call you Dr. Death. And I'm like, no, not so much. And then it just sort of spread. And so I don't know if is this going to be a Zoom broadcast, or are people just going to hear this?
No, it's a broadcast.
Okay, so as you can see, I have a very threatening physical presence. If you were just looking like who is the most threatening person you can imagine. So it was sort of shtick. It was kind of fun, but it breaks into the press for the first time, either through you or Susan, in the Chronicle. And I don't have that article in my file, but it was an article like how do what's Wilson's secret sauce? And as Otto says, it's Dr. Death, right? And so it's all ha until Wilson names me cabinet secretary, and then the headline is operative known as Dr. Death takes over Wilson cabinet. And so by the time I showed up in the Wilson office, people are like, oh my God, like who's this monster? Who's this monster? So I had to live it down for a bit. It sort of faded out after I left political consulting, but every once in a while people remember.
Yeah. All right. Well, Joe Rodota, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. The podcast is Oppo File, and you can find it, I guess, wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah, right. Yep. All the major, everywhere it needs to be. Yep.
And I highly recommend it. It's really great. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks. I enjoyed it. Great. Thanks. Have a great day.